Welcome, welcome, my ukulele friends. I'm Kevin. Today we're going to talk about how to write your own ukulele chord progression. So maybe you've experimented around with some songs, chords, strumming patterns, but you've always wondered, how can I put my own little song together? Well, today we're going to talk about the procedure and how to go through chords, strumming patterns, and keys to put your own progression together. This is going to be a lot of fun. Let's get to it. Hey, before we get started, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and click that alert bell so you know when the next video is coming your way. If you're interested in more learning resources, head over to allforuke.com where we have a full searchable library of songs, song sheets, practice tracks, worksheets, and more. All for you, allforuke.com. The first part of the procedure in putting together a chord progression is choosing a key. So when we talk about choosing a key, we're talking about a group of chords that fit well together. So for instance, we use the key of C, and you'll see this in the graphics below. We have 7 chords that work well together. So with the key of C, our first chord that we can use is C. So we have a C chord here, which is called our 1 chord, and it is also going to be a major chord. So when you're looking at this chord progression to start, you have a root, and the root is also called the tonic. So everything in the key revolves around C. It always wants to resolve to C. It's the most stable part of the key is our root. So if you end a chord progression on C, it's going to feel very final and feel like an arrival. Now, our second chord will always be a minor chord if we're talking about a major key, and the second chord in the key of C is D minor. So the D minor functions as a subdominant chord, which very simply just means that it feels like it's moving away from the tonal center. It's moving away from C. So when you go from C to D minor, you kind of feel like you're taking off from port a little bit. So the 2 chord is minor, it's a D minor, and it's subdominant. The third chord in the key of C is E minor. Now this chord also will always be minor if we're talking about a major key, and it is also a tonic chord. So it also has kind of a feeling of arrival when you end a progression on the 3 chord, but it also kind of will function as kind of adding a little somber element to the equation here because it is a minor chord. Major chords are going to feel happy, minor chords are going to feel sad. So our 3 chord, again, has a tonic function, and it is a minor chord. Our 4 chord is an F chord. So the F chord we can play like this. It is also a subdominant chord. So this is another chord that kind of feels like it's moving away from the tonal center. It moves away from the C. So when you're playing an F chord and you're in the key of C, it's going to kind of feel like you're in motion. So these are things to keep in mind as you're writing your chord progression. Are you trying to create movement? Are you trying to create stability? These are some of the things to think about as we go through these chords here. Our 5 chord in the key of C is the G major chord. So this chord, a very important chord in the key. This is what they call a dominant chord. So this chord is going to feel like it's very unresolved. It has a lot of tension, and that's very important because when you create tension within a chord progression, you're creating a sense of wanting to resolve. So using this 5 chord will make it feel like very unresolved, and it wants to go back to the tonic, and that's the function of the 5 chord. Something else to know about the 5 chord is you can use it as a dominant 7th chord. So anytime you have a 5 chord, you could swap it out if you want to make it sound even more tense, play it as a dominant 7, which would be playing it here as just a G7 chord. Our 6 chord also functions as a tonic. It is called the relative minor chord. So we have C is our 1 chord or our major. Our 6th chord is A minor, and that's just played here on the 2nd fret of the G string. It shares many of the same notes as the root chord, and that's the reason why they can almost be interchangeable. The 1 and the 6th chord sort of function as both as tonic. You can swap them out sometimes. If you play a C chord and you play an A minor chord, there's a lot of shared notes in there, so they're going to have a very similar feel to them. Last but not least, our 7 chord. A very high tension chord. It is also a dominant chord here. And in the key of C, that would be our B diminished chord, which is played right here. And if you listen to this chord, you can almost feel the tension and kind of the wanting to arrive sense that this chord creates. So these are good things to keep in mind as you start thinking about chord progressions. Now, as we get into learning our chord progression here, we're going to try to select some chords to put together from the key. So start thinking about what is subdominant, dominant, tonic, as you start putting your chord progression together, because these are all decisions you'll make in how you want this chord progression to feel. Now let's get into choosing some chords. If you're digging the sound of my uke, head over to allforuke.com/shop. You can have a Kala ukulele for yourself. When you buy your Kala ukulele through All for Uke, you're supporting us, and we really appreciate it. Make sure you check it out. Concerts, sopranos, tenors, baritones, a wide selection of accessories, capos, and more. All for you, allforuke.com/shop. Now that we know our chords and how they function within the key, let's choose a couple of chords to put together here into a chord progression. So for this one, we're just going to put together a 4-chord sequence. But before we do that, we need to think about the context of the chord progression. Are we trying to write a sad progression? Is it a sad story? Is it a happy story? Those come into play as we choose whether we want to use major, minor, diminished. Those are all part of the factor here. So in this situation, I'm going to write a little combination of the two. Something that has a little bit of sadness, a little bit of happiness, a combination of major, minor, and a little bit of dominant 7 action too. So the chord progression I'm going to start off with here, and I'm just going to make this up on the fly here. I feel like starting with something that's going to put me in motion. So I'll pick a chord that's a subdominant chord, which in this case, a great one to choose would be my 2 chord, or the D minor. So I'm in the key of C, but I'm starting with my 2 chord. And this wants to make a move. So I'm going to go through and try to find something that also doesn't resolve. I don't want to go right to my 1 chord, because if I go from D minor back to C, ta-da, I've just arrived. Instead, I'm going to choose to go to my 5 chord, because that 5 chord is going to create a lot of tension, a lot of anticipation. So if moving here from my D minor chord, I'm going to move down to a G7 chord, because that doesn't feel like I've arrived just yet. It's making me feel like it wants to arrive, but it just has not gotten there yet. So we start off, we have our 2 chord, which is minor, our G7 chord, which is our 5-7 chord, and then I'm going to move here to a 6 chord. So it somewhat functions as a tonic, but it's not going to be quite as resolved as going to my root or my C chord. So when I move here from my G chord, or G7 chord rather, I'm going to move to an A minor. So I still kind of feel like I'm in motion. I'm on my 6 chord. I've traveled quite a distance away from the root right now. So if I want to make it feel resolved, I could end it on C, or I never have to resolve this, and I could keep it in motion and go somewhere else, maybe like the 4 chord, which also has that feeling of traveling. So instead of going from A minor to my C chord, I'm going to go from my A minor to my F chord. So now I kind of feel like the story continues on. So let's put these together and take a listen to what it sounds like. So we have D minor, I'm in motion. G7, I'm building tension. A minor, a little melancholy, still a little bit of movement. And then I'm going to my F chord, still in motion. I've never arrived at that root or that tonic chord of C, so I don't have that feeling of arrival. So now when I play these chords, I like that. So we have our 4 chords now. What is the next step in the procedure? Adding a bit of rhythm to it. So when we talk about rhythm, we're talking about different strumming patterns, we're talking about tempo, And those are also going to be big factors here in creating the story of our chord progression. If we choose a pattern that feels like it's very happy sounding, very rhythmic, that's going to kind of take this chord progression and keep it moving along with a good feel. So now we have motion created with our chords, and we'll also have motion created with the rhythm. So let's take, for instance, the island strum. If we put that in, it's a very happy sounding strumming pattern. It creates a lot of motion. It has a little bit of anticipation in it. So let's try that and see what it sounds like with this chord progression, just using one time of the island strum on each chord. So again, the island strum, if you haven't played it, is down, down, up, up, down, up, down, down, up, up, down, up. So let's take a listen to our chord progression with that strumming pattern. 2, 3, 4. I like it. It's got some movement. Well, that's pretty cool. We could also take this chord progression and do it in a different time signature. So the island strum is in 4/4 time, but let's say we want to make it a little bit more of a waltzy feel. And we could use a 3/4 strumming pattern. And I've got a bunch of strumming patterns and a series about strumming if you want to check that out as well. But just a brief here, a 3/4 strumming pattern that we could use would be down, down, up, which we would count 1, 2, and 3, and. So let's take a look at this same chord progression if I were just to change the strumming pattern. So let's try this with a 3 count. 1, 2, 3, down, down, down. Totally different feel. 1, 2, and 3, and 1, 2, and 3, and 1, 2, and 3, and 1, 2, and 3. So you can see here the difference in rhythm can change the whole texture of the tune that you're putting together. So as you're kind of putting together your own chord progressions, try some different strumming patterns, see what feels good to you, make up your own strumming patterns, use a strumming pattern from a song that you like, implement that into a chord progression that you've put together. All of these things can be added to that chord sequence and make it your own. Here's a bonus tip for you, and something that I find myself doing often is studying some of the greats. If you like a chord progression from a song by the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones, take a look at that chord progression, figure out what key it is, what is the numerical movement that's happening, and maybe try to use that same chord progression in one of your songs. Or take some of those chords, flip them around, put them in a different order, change the strumming pattern. Imitation is a great way to write your own chord progression and use some of the infrastructure from songs that already are great songs. So give that a try. In addition to that, my challenge to you is to put together your own chord progression and share it here with the All For You community in the comments. And I'll go through and pick a few of my favorites to play for you guys on Instagram, and you can check those out. I'll let you know when those are coming out, but I will leave it to you to leave those comments. I'm also going to put together a free PDF at allforyouke.com that you can download for free. Check it out. I'll put some popular chord sequences together that I think are pretty cool with some chords and strumming patterns so you can practice and try some of these on your own. Maybe you can put some lyrics to your songs. I think this is going to be a really fun exercise for you to explore and feel creative with your instrument. My name is Kevin. Thank you so much for watching today. I'll see you next time.
Let's get